This is the Grow Your Clinic podcast from Clinic Mastery. We help progressive health professionals to lead inspired teams, transform client experiences, and build clinics for good. Now, it's time to grow your clinic.
Welcome to another episode of the Grow Your Clinic podcast. My name is Jack O'Brien, your host, and I'm really excited to bring another guest to the podcast today. We are continuing our theme of spotlights on Clinic Mastery members, and this guy is a superstar. I'm humbled and privileged to be able to work with Darron, and I can't wait to share his journey and story with you. So I have with us today Darron Goralsky. How are you, Darron?
I'm great, Jack. Thank you for inviting me onto the show.
It is our absolute pleasure, Darron. So for those unfamiliar, Darron is the founder and director of More Than Physio, which is a musculoskeletal private practice physiotherapy clinic in Melbourne, a multidisciplinary clinic actually. And alongside More Than Physio Clinic, Darron is also the founder and director of the Melbourne TMJ and Facial Pain Centre, working specifically with temporomandibular joint disorders and facial pain conditions. Darron, that's quite a long title and a number of different entities. So tell us, I've got a couple of icebreaker questions before we go into the specifics of your clinic, your practice, and your journey as a clinic owner. Are you ready for those questions?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, number one, what are you reading or learning right now?
I'm actually reading a fascinating book called The Sistine Secrets. I recently returned from an amazing family holiday to Europe, predominantly to Italy. And I was inspired to learn a little bit more about Michelangelo and what inspired him. And so there's a really insightful book called The Sistine Secrets, which I'm finding quite fascinating.
Yeah, right. I'll have to add that to my Amazon wish list. That's awesome. Thank you. Number two, who inspires you?
I guess one of the people that I do find quite inspirational is somebody like Richard Branson, who I think is a visionary and has really gone out there and made things happen. The other person who I find quite inspirational is Elon Musk, always looking for smarter ways to do things. So, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. It's quite an interesting time and season for Tesla at the moment. Elon is doing a great job. Okay, thank you. Number three, what did you want to be growing up?
I actually always wanted to be a physiotherapist.
Really?
I was one of those kids that when I was very young, my grandfather, who's subsequently passed on, he was a mechanic by trade, so very good with his hands, and he would always come and massage my neck and my back. So I tried to mimic him as a really young kid. And whenever we'd have our Sunday afternoon family gatherings, all the aunts and uncles would ask me to come and massage their necks as I went around the room in a circle. And I was always fascinated with the body. So I went, I was one of the youngest guys to join the local gym when it opened up. I think I was about 14 at the time. And just always wanted to pursue my goals of becoming a physiotherapist. Mind you, that didn't happen that easily because it was very, very hard to get in South Africa to physiotherapy, even more so from a statistical point of view of
applicants
to places than getting into medicine.
Right. Yeah.
So I never got in after school and spent 3 years full-time at uni studying first commerce and then Bachelor of Physical Education, not completing either of those two. And then eventually did get into physiotherapy. So by the time I got in, I was just so hungry for it that I absolutely lapped it up. I really loved it. Yeah.
That's awesome. I know a lot of physios or health practitioners in general end up having a passion for their career later in life, not so much as a child. So that's really interesting. Number four, Darron, finally, what's a motto that you live by?
Nobody can do your push-ups for you.
Tell me more. Say more.
Well, I think that one has to take personal responsibility. If you really want to make things happen, I think you can engage the best personal trainer and buy the latest gear, but the actual effort's got to come out of those arms, because if you're not doing the push-ups yourself, they're not something that anyone can do for you. So I've always believed that if I want to make things happen, it's got to start first and foremost with me.
I love it. That's awesome. I can definitely see that from the way you live your life. No one can do your push-ups for you. Unreal. So, okay, Darren, step us through the journey of the young fella wanting to get into physio, studied a few other things, finally get there. Now, all the way through to owning a fantastic multidisciplinary clinic. You've got a specialist clinic as well, leading an incredible team. You've progressed now to coming off the tools and focusing solely on your leadership. But step us through the journey of, was private practice always on your radar, or what happened after uni to get you to where you are now?
So, yes, I was always interested in going directly into private practice. In fact, the first 6 months of my qualified life, I was half-time in private practice and half-time working in a really massive hospital in South Africa called Baragwanath Hospital, which is a 3,000-bed hospital.
Wow.
I used to be an old army barracks, and I was thrown in the deep end because I, at that time, said I had an interest in hands. And so they put me in charge of hand therapy, working with the surgeons. So it was really being thrown into the deep end. But then the motto at Baragwanath Hospital, which sort of follows through in all of healthcare in South Africa at the time, was watch one, do one, teach one. So at the same time, I was incredibly fortunate to have been given a job with one of my idols, who was a guest lecturer in our final year of study, a lady called Fran Mallon, who I'll be forever indebted to. Unfortunately, she passed on quite young. But my 3 years of working at her practice really, really helped me carve out the course of the rest of my career. She was a manual therapist extraordinaire. She taught predominantly the Maitland technique, but she taught it internationally. And working for her under such close supervision was like doing, a 3-year postgrad. And that all in addition to having actually done a postgrad that she was lecturing on. So a postgrad in orthopedic manipulative therapy while working at her practice. So after 6 months of being at the hospital, I recognized that I really wanted to stay in musculoskeletal private practice world so that I could just develop skills in that area. So I worked with her until I immigrated here to Melbourne.
Mm-hmm. And then upon arriving in Melbourne, how did you end up starting your own clinic?
Well, I came to a job which unfortunately never really worked out the way that I had planned. Actually, prior to starting that job, while I was still in South Africa, I was offered another job, and I declined that because I'd already accepted the first one. So when the first job here in Melbourne didn't really work out, I approached the second person, ended up working there, and that had its issues too.
There's a common denominator here, Darren.
Yeah, working for somebody who didn't really think that soft tissue work was really required, told me that the only trigger points are the ones in my head. It was quite an unhappy experience for me, and following that, I decided that I really did need to go out on my own. So fortunately, I had lunch with a really fantastic physiotherapist that I had worked with at the first practice. And he had left when I left, and he went traveling overseas. And when he got back to Melbourne, he contacted me, we caught up, and he said, hey, I'm thinking of starting up a practice on my own. He's a local Melbourne boy, so he understood the lay of the land, so to speak, which is I never did. So we actually formed a practice together, and we were together for 2.5 years. Eventually, we had a second location, and we were essentially running 2 separate practices. So came to a point in time where we figured out that we were probably better off, pushing our own wheelbarrows rather than running 2 locations, but really didn't have a lot of commonality in what we wanted so clinically. So yeah, started to build what we have today.
And you really have built something remarkable, man. And I'm super inspired by yourself in conjunction. So you touched on hand therapy, and now it's TMJ. So connect the dots for me. How did you end up becoming so niche and specialized in TMJ?
Well, when I first came to Melbourne, money was tight, so we lived hand to mouth. I'm joking.
It was only. I'm surprised you've held out this long on the dad jokes.
Well, when I worked for Fran back in Johannesburg, she basically said, look, if it's got muscles, bones, there's joints, there's ligaments, it's within the physiotherapist's scope of practice.
Mm-hmm.
So she sort of set the expectation right from day one. And in actual fact, we used to treat some TMJ stuff in her practice back in the day. I don't quite remember, given that it was 26 years ago, what it was that we were doing. But interestingly enough, when I relocated to my current clinic and was unpacking some boxes that I had in storage, I came across the South African Physiotherapy Association's magazine, the sort of In Motion magazine equivalent.
Right.
And I thought, wow, that's a bit interesting. Why did I hang on to this magazine? And then I looked at the front page and there was an article by her, Fran Mellon, on the role of the physiotherapist management of TMD alongside the dental profession.
Wow.
So probably the die was cast a long time ago.
Uh-huh.
And I do remember when I first arrived here, approaching some dentists and some dental specialists saying, hey, I've got an interest in treating TMJ conditions. And I was met with, smiles, but it never really translated into anything at all. And it was always kind of kept on the back burner. I then went and studied craniosacral therapy through the Upledger Institute, which is really an osteotechnique. And in some of the more advanced levels, we do quite a lot of mouth work, so intraoral work. And I started to see that kind of tied into the TMJ space that I was already kind of dabbling with. And probably maybe, I don't know the exact year, but maybe 9-10 years ago, I really made the decision. I was quite frustrated at the time because for the occasional patient that I was getting who was suffering from TMD, I was able to get reasonably good results and felt I had something to offer. But having them listed on my website as just one of another 50 things that we treat wasn't really bringing people through the door. Right. And it was at that point in time that I had to make a decision. If I really wanted to pursue my passion in helping people in that specific niche, that I really needed to put other things aside and focus on that clinically. And that's what I did do. And I guess the rest is as a result of having made that one decision.
Yeah, okay. So let's pull on that thread a little bit further. For listeners who might not be in the physio or MSK space, when we say TMJ, it's temporomandibular joint, which is your jaw, and TMD refers to temporomandibular disorder. How has that evolved now to you effectively creating your own unique method? What's been the story behind that?
Through my training, first at physio school and then when I worked for Fran, I'm very structured in the way that I like to think about things. Things need to make sense to me in a logical order. And I, first of all, just understood based on, first of all, Fran's assurance, but second of all, my understanding of how the body works, that things are always connected. And as long as you consider all those connections and everything that may affect them, you can have a greater impact on any condition when you're looking at it in that perspective. And I remember Fran used to say to me, whenever you're treating a patient, you have to have your 2 camera lenses on. You've got to have your telephoto lens to zoom in onto what's the actual issue here. But you need your wide angle lens to understand the context in which that issue has arisen. Wow. And so the way that I have always practiced has always been very logical and structured. And formulating my approach to TMJ conditions follows that same logic. I understand that the cranium and the TMJ function very interdependently. Rather than the name TMD, temporomandibular disorder, I believe it should be called craniomandibular disorder, hence the Goralsky craniomandibular method. And much of what's in that method is not necessarily technique that I've exclusively developed on my own, but it's the learnings that I've gathered over the years from courses and conferences and shadowing other therapists in their practices. In fact, I went back to South Africa for a week and spent an incredible week observing and working alongside a TMJ physiotherapist in Johannesburg, which was just very fortuitous because there's a funny backstory behind that. After making the decision to actually hone in on this area of speciality, I was sitting at my parents-in-law for dinner one Friday night, and my wife's stepdad, married to my mother-in-law, his son and girlfriend came for dinner from South Africa. Mm-hmm. And I had never met his girlfriend before. She's now his wife. And she said to me, Michael told me that you're a physiotherapist. So I said, yeah. She said, my mum's a physiotherapist in Johannesburg. So I thought, well, if she's older than me, I might know her, I might have heard of her. I said, what is her name? So she gave me her name, and I said, no, sorry, but I don't recognize the name. So she said, oh, no, you probably wouldn't have heard of her. She's not a regular physiotherapist. So I said, does she work in the hospital system? She said, no, she specializes in treating TMJ and facial pain. And I said, you're kidding, right? She said, no, why would I kid? I said, Michael's put you up to this. She said, no, why would he? So I said, because that's my area of interest.
Wow.
And what followed from that was a 90-minute phone call to this lady. And I said to her, it's amazing. If you'll have me, you tell me when I can come and I'll spend time with you. And she said, yeah, anytime it works. And because my parents lived there, it made sense. And I spent an incredible week in her clinic, sharing the learnings that I discovered. It was interesting because she was working very much in isolation, and I was able to bring some perspective to what she was always doing, but I had some bit more of a scientific explanation behind why it was working. And of course, I learned a lot from her too. So it was an amazing collaboration, and experiences like that have, in a major way shaped my own approach over the years. So that's part of the journey.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm really excited to see the creation and evolution of this Goralsky craniomandibular method. It's like I say, it's more than just techniques. It's a philosophy and an approach to helping people solve complex issues, which is really exciting. And so I know, Darron, as you became more niched and more an expert in that particular area, your clinic grew and you specifically got busier. So can you maybe paint us a picture of where your clinic was at 2 years ago when we first crossed paths?
Yeah. Well, the challenge that I was faced with was, as the practice became more well known and the demand, with new patients kept growing, so my hours just got longer and longer and longer. The waiting list grew, the caseload grew. And eventually I did have to take on another physiotherapist that I mentored and trained. And then she left to go and live in Hong Kong. And then there've been various physios that have been trained over the time. But really the bulk of that work was being done by me. And it got to the point where I was consulting 60 hours a week, getting to work at 20 to 8 in the morning, getting home 8:30, 8:45, 4 days a week, 6 o'clock on Friday, and then often having to spend Sundays really just trying to stay afloat, catching up with notes and letters and stuff like that. And with my 50th birthday looming in June of 2019, I remember coming back from an annual 2-week holiday in January 2018 and saying to my wife, I don't know if I can do this anymore at that pace. And of course, the practice is our one source of income. My wife helps me. She works in the practice. And so we just kept going at that pace for years, just because of demand and because of need. And I was feeling very desperate, actually, as to what would the long-term prospects be, because seeing 23 patients a day sometimes, close to 100 appointments a week, it actually wears you down. And it was at that point where I realized that I'd actually dug an incredibly deep professional hole for myself. we had no real systems in the practice. I mean, my treatment is very systemized, but
Sure.
around that, there wasn't any consistent structure or systems that we could rely on. It was all being done very ad hoc, despite the fact that I had a great team. And that was when I really decided that I'm giving myself 18 months or just less than that to actually make some fundamental changes by the time I turned 50, which was June last year. And that was when I was very lucky to, through a sequence of events, which we don't really need to waste too much time on, actually was introduced to you guys at Clinic Mastery, and it's been quite the journey, hasn't it?
It's been a wild ride, and full credit to you and the progress that you've been able to instill in your clinic. So we've got an understanding of where you were at. Where are you at now at the start of 2020?
So over the period of it was actually 20 months from when I started till the end of December last year. Over that period, I kept pulling hours out in big chunks. And I knew that for every 10 hours or so that I pulled out, there needed to be a team member brought on and trained and mentored to actually be able to replace the caseload. I haven't employed 6 people since, but we were kind of working towards a model of maybe 10 to 20 hours. Mm-hmm. And so as of the end of December last year, 23rd of December was the last day of my consulting life for the foreseeable future. At that point in time, I was down to 17 hours of clinical work from October till the end of December. And I was quite nervous because I thought to myself, well, I'm going away on holiday, which is fantastic. I'm coming back to Melbourne. My youngest son is going to be overseas for a year on a gap year program. My older boy stayed in Europe backpacking. He's still not back. So we were coming back to an empty nest for a month. And I was coming back to work. And for the very first time in 26 years, I wasn't treating patients. And I was concerned as to how I would feel. I thought maybe I'm going to feel a little bit lost because as healthcare professionals, we tend to place a lot of our self-worth around how many people we can help as caregivers. And certainly in my case, I can't speak for everybody, my sense of self-worth and self-fulfillment was largely boosted by helping others. And I remember the first question that Daniel from Clinic Mastery asked me in a very long phone call. It was another 90-minute phone call, the first contact that I made with him. He said to me, how many people can you help in a week? And I said, well, he actually said, why did you do physiotherapy? And I said, because I love helping other people and etc. And he said, well, how many people can you help in a week? And I remember saying, well, here's the problem. I'm currently around, 90 to 100, but it's killing me. And I don't know how much longer I can do that for, which means if something happens, I'm going to be helping less people.
Sure.
So he said to me, well, how many more people could you help if you teach others to do what you do? It was a question that it might seem like a simple question, but when you really sit and reflect on that and you think, am I still adding value to people's lives if I'm not the caregiver? And I've had to, over the period of time, I've come to realize that I can definitely multiply the effect that I was having as a practitioner in an unlimited way to some extent by making sure that the system of treatment or the approach of treatment that I have, which is already quite systemized, because that's just the way that I operate. If I just consistently make sure that that is being used over and over to train new team members to be able to do what I do, and then spend more of my time mentoring them to give them my experience so that we can fast track their growth curve and their experience curve. And so we've been doing that all the while. It's just that it's become much more of the focus now. The other thing that made a big difference, I guess, quelled some of that anxiety coming into this part of the year, was working with yourself to actually define what is that role that a CEO of a business is needs to fulfill, and how do we create structure around the week, knowing that when I come back, I'm not just going to be, going from latte to latte, because I want to know that I especially if I'm not deriving or benefiting the practice by producing income.
Sure.
I want to know that I'm producing value. And so with the default diary of knowing that on a Monday, my focus is X, on Tuesday, it's Y, with the tasks listed out, it's given me a lot of comfort knowing that if I tick those boxes, I'm meeting my obligations to the practice, to myself, to my family. And so at the moment, I'm loving it. I'm sure I'm still finding my feet. And, there's always little fires to put out, but it's given me the opportunity to really take the time to focus on things that have really never seen the light of day in some cases.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for your vulnerability and leaning into the process and trusting the process. I think an interesting distinction is that, like you said, your identity was really wrapped up in helping people, and now you're off the tools. And you said for the foreseeable future. So whether this is infinitum forever or perhaps just for a season, I think what you've done is created an environment where you've got the choice, which is a real credit. So the way you treat and the way you structured your clinic was very dependent on you. And I remember having conversations around, how do we teach others to do what you do? Or patients are never going to see anyone else. They only want to see me. And now they don't have the choice to see you. What are some of the leadership lessons or perhaps mindset shifts that you've had around leadership over the last couple of years?
I first of all had to acknowledge that the value that I have to the practice actually is not just in the consulting room. Maybe I wasn't giving myself enough credit for what I've built and for the fact that I've got people around me that depend on me. These are people in my team, not my patients, patients aside. So I've had to, in some cases, give myself more credit than I have. In some cases, I've also had to look at the areas that I feel are really lacking and give myself the opportunity to improve on those. But one of the lessons that I've learned, and I think sometimes this is a big stumbling block to people taking the first step, is recognizing that just as some people can't treat their own TMJ problem themselves, and they've looked at YouTube videos, or they've gone to their local practitioner, who's very good with maybe ankles and knees, but not that great with TMJs. They all come see us, and we feel very comfortable with the fact that, yes, the service costs a little bit more. The treatments are very in-depth. We give a lot of value for what we charge. And the same way as we see ourselves as the experts that are worth paying for, so too in my business, when I'm now encountering something where I'm just not good at it, or I just don't know what to do, I'm going to get a better result by investing money in engaging somebody who is specialized in that, who is going to help me get there more quickly and with a better outcome. And I think I see that as a stumbling block to some people taking that big step to finding a mentor or joining an academy like Clinic Masteries. They look at the dollars and they go, I couldn't afford that. And I remember speaking to some members recently at one of the quarterly workshops and said to them, if this is the way you feel and you come for help and you recognize that you can't do this on your own, then it's almost like you can't afford not to make that investment.
Wow.
So that wasn't an insight that I needed to get for myself.
Yeah, that's incredible. So if I can ask a direct question, what's been the return for you? Whether that's however you want to frame that, personally, commercially, clinic, what's been the return on your business academy journey?
Well, definitely the team has grown. The turnover has gone up. The challenge when you are the hugest income producer in the clinic, at one stage I was bringing in 40% of total turnover across 9 practitioners.
So, and just to be clear, you're not bringing in any income now, and revenue's still progressed.
So revenues progress, but obviously expenses do go up because now you're engaging others to see those 60 hours of patients. But the thing that you can't even quantify a real value on is the amount of time that I've brought back, and the change in my whole demeanor. Patients and team members and and friends have said to me, you look like a different person. You're just not constantly fatigued. You're not constantly stressed. And I didn't actually think that I was a stressed person, but obviously I was just living with an underlying stress that was just normal after 26 years. And I really feel like I'm in such a strong position now to really be able to dedicate my time and energy to whatever I think is most important, whether it be personally or whether it be in my clinic. And in my clinic in particular, so that I can turn around in 6 months' time and say, that was a very justifiable move. And my new motto, which is up on my wall over here, which you can't see, it says, I don't get paid by the hour, I get paid by the value I bring to the hour. And so it's just about reframing my sense of self-worth and making sure that I do hold myself accountable to bringing value to every hour.
If we go back to the leadership elements, you said your team has grown, and I know that there's a wide variety of practitioners on your team. I know some of them are older, some of them are younger, and some of them are in between. And age doesn't really matter. But tell me, has your mindset changed or shifted when it comes to perhaps younger practitioners and being able to train them and pass on this Goralsky CM method? That's craniomandibular method, just to be clear. There's a CM alliteration there. But how do you go training younger practitioners versus older, and what's your mindset shift on that been?
So the vast majority of people that I've brought on since I started this process are actually, newer grads. Mm-hmm. And the reason that I have a preference for them is that I can really mold them into the practitioners that I feel are the best fit for my team. Mm-hmm. Because you can find a physiotherapist that's had 20 years of experience, but they may not have ever treated TMJ patients. And so what are they really bringing to the TMJ equation? Yes, of course, they're good professionals, and they're in their own right, they're awesome, and they're a huge asset to anyone's team. But in terms of technical skill that we need in order for our treatment process to stay fairly consistent, and I think that's the key from my perspective, is being able to have my system or my methodology be consistently repeated across different practitioners, so that when the time came to step back, I could say with full confidence to my patients, you will get very similar treatment from Bob or from Jane. Mm-hmm. Knowing that because I've trained them and they didn't know how to do it any other way.
Great.
And that's been a key part of our success. So we've also gone so far as to actually video all of our training, so that the practitioners can have access in their training process to videos of all those technical skills and some of the soft skills, some of the scripting, some of the talking about our values, why we do certain things. So that's one of the fantastic things that I've got through this process in the academy, is learning the value of systemizing things to produce a repeatable result until we decide that there's a better way to do something. Then we'll change that video, we'll change that process.
I love it, mate. And I love that progress over perfection, that we're constantly evolving. Darren, you've touched on filming some of the way you go about stuff, scripting. You've really built an asset. You've really built something that is really strong, stable, predictable over the long term. What else have you been able to add to your practice over the last couple of years that you didn't have previously? I'm thinking dashboards or experiences, or what have you been able to add?
So first of all, prior to joining the academy, we were very, very old school. So we were still handwriting notes. We never had a cloud-based system. We never had online bookings. We had very little automation. And I remember reports were an absolute nightmare because I would spend Sundays trying to catch up on reports. It became the bane of my life. I remember going with my wife to my older boy's soccer games, which would be out in, like 45 minutes away, and sitting in the back of the car, typing on my iPad letters to doctors that were outstanding. It was ridiculous. It really was ridiculous. It wasn't a lie. And we've got lots of templates. We've got a lot of automation. Obviously, the reports have to be very specific to the patient, but there's a lot of structure you can put in to make it more time efficient. And just in the last week, just having had the opportunity, now that I'm not consulting, I've gone and updated a whole lot of our templates because I've had the opportunity to look at them and say, we can do this better. And there's some things that your practice manager can't do for you. They can't do the clinical visionary stuff. It's got, so that's been a huge thing that we've changed is the software. We use a lot of automation through things that work well with Clinico, like Clinic Apps, PhysiTrack. We do weekly mentoring meetings, and I also took the view that if I wasn't doing something or I wasn't doing it well, and I was being taught to do it in the academy, I wasn't really going to question it. If you said you need a jump, all I really wanted to know was how high and how often. And so everything that we've done in our mentoring sessions, where I have to fill in a focus sheet so that we can keep our mentor sessions on point, I've just duplicated that with my team.
So good. The extent to which you've systemized what needs to be systemized, but yet still created an incredibly human experience, and the client nurturing, the ability to see clients through their management plans to create amazing outcomes and incredible experiences is remarkable. As we land the plane, Darron, if you had any advice, tips, or wisdom for clinic owners listening, the platform is yours. What would you say?
I think probably there's a few key learnings that I have. Number one is there's always a better way to do something. You may already be doing something, but as we both know, Josh Norbido, magnificent magician, his saying is, but how good am I at doing this?
So good.
It's not about saying, I'm already doing that. Perhaps you could do it in a better way.
Right.
And on that note, I actually want to tell one of my favorite stories, if that's okay.
Go for it, please.
It's about the young girl who goes to her mother, and she says, Mum, how come when we cook a roast, we cut the end off it? The mother said, well, that's just our family tradition. Your grandmother taught me to cut the end off the roast, so that's what we do. So she said, but that doesn't really make sense. So she went to her grandmother and she said, hey, Granny, how come when you cook a roast, you and Mum cut the end off the roast? She said, what are you talking about? That's just our family tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So she said, well, where did you learn that from? She said, from my mother. And fortunately, her great-grandmother was still alive. Mm-hmm. So she went to her and she said, great granny, she said, I'm confused. Both Mum and Grandma say that you taught them to cut the end off a roast because it's our family tradition. Why did you do that? So her grandmother said, family tradition? She said, what are you talking about? I've got a small oven. And so sometimes we're in such a rut with things we do. And in principle, they may make sense, but there can always be a better way. We need to constantly evaluate if we can do something in a better way. Maybe we don't need to do it at all. And so it's been a real reflective process for me the last 20 months, being able to analyze everything that I do. And some things we do really well and we didn't need to change them. But then there are things that were just a waste of time or they weren't delivering a result. So I think being open to critically analyzing every aspect of your business and taking the time to do that, I think is really important. Asking for help and recognizing there are people that have got skills that you don't have. And we shouldn't be hard on ourselves. We're healthcare practitioners. We're not marketers. We're not financial people. And so we're not IT people. We need to enlist the help of those around us that can get a better result for us. Even if it costs us money up front, there'll probably be a bigger payoff at the end. And then I think the last part is finding a niche. I think if people can find a niche that they're passionate about and they can focus on bringing something to the table in that niche, they're going to put themselves apart from practices around that might be more generalist. And then once you've got a niche, and even if you're just working in it yourself, think the whole time, if I were to have that first employee join me and I was going to train them, what would I need? And so I was already developing materials and processes in anticipation of replicating that training from the very beginning. So that would be my advice.
Mate, that's perennial advice. I think everyone can learn something from that and from your journey and this whole conversation. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing. Thank you for leaning into the process, and thank you for story time with Uncle Darron. There's got to be an element of that. But thank you for sharing. If people wanted to have a peekaboo at your clinic, or perhaps say good day to you on LinkedIn, is it okay if we link those up in the show notes?
Yeah, sure. That'd be
awesome.
Fun.
So listeners, that'll be More Than Physio and Darron Goralsky, and we'll link that up over at clinicmastery.com/podcast. All of the show notes and the links will be over there. Darron, thank you so much for joining us, mate. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the opportunity to share a bit of insight. Hopefully it's been helpful to somebody out there.
I have absolutely no doubt, mate. And listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Please do leave us a rating and review over on iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher. Check out the show notes. And we can't wait to bring you another episode of the Grow Your Clinic podcast again really soon. For now, goodbye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Grow Your Clinic podcast. To find out more about past episodes or how we can help you, head to www.clinicmastery.com/podcast. And please remember to rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. See you on the next episode.